Good evening. Hi. When I tell people I wear many hats at the museum, I just want you to know that it's true. I move furniture and make introductory remarks. I'm Emily August, I should tell you that. I oversee programs and communications here at the National Museum of American Jewish History. We are thrilled to be hosting tonight's program with Penn's Cat Center. We've been a longtime partner of theirs, and we're so grateful to Steve Weitzman and Albert, Natalie, Etty, Diana, the whole team over there for their collaboration. Doing programming with the Cat Center really lets us take a deeper dive into content that we explore to some extent in the museum every day, but get the chance to dive in with some deeper academic rigor and get to invite people like Inga Saffron back to the museum to lead programs like this one, which is very exciting for us. A little bit of namage. You're all insiders now. We call the museum internally namage. Housekeeping. You've probably seen us painting the town literally red with RBG, Ruth Bader Ginsburg materials. We are really, really excited to be 4 weeks into the run of Notorious RBG, The Life and Times of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, which is a wonderful special exhibition, temporary, only through January 12th, up on our 5th floor, that explores the legacy of RBG beyond the stories you might know. And we have some wonderful programming that goes along with that, including next Thursday, a little bit of an unexpected program. We're hosting an improvisational theater group, not improv in the way you might think of, more like comedic improv, but improvisational live theater that's created on the spot, inspired by stories that the audience offers. And the theme, in honor of RBG, is stories of influential women. So that's next Thursday, November 7th. Hope that you join us. Don't forget to vote on November 5th. And lots of other RBG-related paraphernalia about our programs in the concourse lobby. Please help yourself on the way out. I think that's all the housekeeping I will make you suffer through from me. Please let me introduce you to Ann Albert, and I will read her title because I want to get it right and she deserves that. She is the Klatt Family Director for Public Programming and the Managing Editor of Jewish Quarterly Review at the Herbert D. Cat Center for Advanced Judaic Studies at the University of Pennsylvania.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me all right? Okay. So thank you so much, Emily, and to the museum, to Namaj, for being, and to all the staff and the members also of Namaj for their interest in our programming tonight and over the years. As Emily said, we've been sort of best buds as institutions for the last 8 or 9 years. We've put on a number of fantastic co-presentations, and we're just so grateful for the museum for their partnership with us. As Emily said, my name is Ann Albert, and I am the Director for Public Programs at the Cat Center. For those who don't know, the Cat Center is the Herbert D. Katz Center for Advanced Judaic Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. That's the mouthful that you already heard. The Cat Center is a kind of a unique entity within Penn in that we're not a teaching program. We're not even located on campus. We're actually down here at 4th and Walnut. And we are a research institute devoted to research in Jewish history and Jewish culture. So our primary activity, our main mission, is focused on a fellowship program where we bring a cohort of scholars from universities around the world, 15 or 20 of them every year, to come and work side by side in Philadelphia on various projects that are interrelated around a common theme. This year's theme is home, or the Jewish home, and it has proven to be a really capacious and generative theme that's bringing us across the full span of Jewish history, from ancient archaeology to Mizrahi Jews in Israel today, including various dimensions of domestic practice and kinship and family, gender. All kinds of different things are coming together under this umbrella of home. And so with that said, like Emily, I am contractually obligated to point out that we have other programs coming up in the near future. So if you're interested in learning more about what the Cat Center does and about what we have coming up, I do encourage you to take our brochures, which are out front on the tables to sign up for our mailing list. I was specifically instructed to ask you to get on our mailing list so that you can find out about upcoming programs. The two that we have coming up in the next month or so, one is related to the urban development of, early urban development in Tel Aviv, and that's in conjunction with the Gershman Philadelphia Jewish Film Festival in November. And the other one is right back here in this room on December 5th, where we'll have a scholar talking about the ketubah, right, the Jewish wedding contract, as an artifact that moves between home and museum, as something that's a matter of ritual and law and decoration and art all at once. So if you have a wedding in your family, provides some good context. All right, with all of that said, this particular program tonight is part of a two-part, is the second in a two-part series devoted to influential Jewish architects. And this series was organized in conjunction with the Athenaeum, which, if you're not familiar with it, is also a venerable intellectual institution and private library in Philadelphia. And while I mentioned that, I should really express my deep gratitude to the Athenaeum's director, Beth Hessel, who embraced this partnership with us, even I think in her first 2 or 3 weeks on the job this summer, showing a real confidence in the ability to make things happen together in her new role. Unfortunately, since the first half already happened, you're out of luck. You missed that first wonderful talk. But the Athenaeum still has an exhibit on Henry Magaziner, who was the subject of that talk, which is ongoing, I think, through December in their space over on 6th Street. So if you're interested, do check that out. I also want to really thank David Brownlee, who I'll introduce in a moment, who's on our panel, and the School of Arts and Sciences and Penn School of Design, now the Stuart Weitzman School of Design, and the, well, I get the name wrong, Humanities and Urbanism and Design Initiative that's housed there that David's involved with. We at the Cat Center came to this year and this desire to do programming connected with design and architecture from a place of interest in Jewish culture, right? From a place of Jewish studies. And we needed a guide, someone to bring us into conversation with other fields. And David served as that guide. It was wonderful. Through a conversation with him, we were able to set up this program, which really brings together all of the people that you would want to put in the room if you wanted to have a good chat about Kahn. So that is what we hope is going to happen. And with that, I'll just briefly introduce our speakers and we can be on our way. So so our moderator tonight, who will be at the far end, you can imagine her sitting in that chair. Our moderator will be Inga Saffron, who you probably all know very well as the architecture critic for the Philadelphia Inquirer, where she writes a weekly Philadelphia-focused column on architecture, urban design, and planning. Her work has been recognized with numerous awards, including the Pulitzer Prize for Criticism, the Vincent Scully Prize from the National Building Museum, and a Loeb Fellowship from Harvard University's Graduate School of Design. Her writings appeared in the New York Times Book Review, The New Republic, Metropolis, Dwell, and more. And if that's not enough, I only recently learned that she also served as a war correspondent in Bosnia and Chechnya. So I'm hoping she can handle you guys in the Q&A. Next to Inga in the next seat will be Bill Whitaker, who is a curator and collections manager of the Architectural Archives at Penn's Design School. He's co-author of a absolutely gorgeous book called The Houses of Louis Kahn, the first comprehensive study of the architect's house designs, for which he happens to have won the Athenaeum's Literary Award a few years ago. And he served as a curatorial consultant for the major exhibition of Kahn's work called Louis Kahn, The Power of Architecture, which then toured around the world. Beyond Kahn, of course, Bill also has done a lot of work in a lot of areas. He's organized and co-curated over 30 exhibitions, including retrospectives on Wharton Esherick, among others. He's co-organizer of something called the Design with Nature Now a program of exhibitions, conferences, and public programs that highlight dynamic and visionary approaches to landscape design and development in the face of climate change and global urbanization. In the next seat, so the middle of the three panelists, you will find Susan G. Solomon. Susan is an architectural historian who earned her doctorate at Penn. We are like an all-Penn crew tonight, and is now lucky enough to work as an independent scholar, writing, lecturing, and teaching widely, and following her interests as she pleases, which is a rare pleasure, I think. She's written 2 books on Kahn. One is on his Jewish Community Center in Trenton, and one called Kahn's Jewish Architecture, Mikveh Israel and the Mid-Century American Synagogue. Solomon has also authored 2 books on urban playgrounds, one called American Playgrounds, and one called The Science of Play. And this is a topic that seems totally unrelated to what we're talking about tonight, but she notes that that topic had its genesis for her in 2 unbuilt Kahn projects, and I'm really hoping that we might hear more about that. She's currently writing a book on the architectural decoration of mid-century synagogue interiors. Finally, David Brownlee, who I already mentioned, is the Francis Shapiro Weitzenhofer Professor of Art History at Penn. He is, of course, a widely recognized and accomplished historian of modern architecture and urbanism in Europe and America. He's the author or co-author of many books that I could not possibly list all of, but they include Louis I. Kahn in the Realm of Architecture, Making a Modern Classic, The Architecture of the Philadelphia Museum of Art, Out of the Ordinary, Robert Venturi, Denise Scott Brown, and Associates, and others, many of which have to do with local Philadelphia architecture. He's also served on literally all of the main organizations of historical preservation, the Historic Preservation Board of Pennsylvania, the Philadelphia Historical Commission, the Philadelphia Society for the Preservation of Landmarks, the Preservation Alliance of Greater Philadelphia, and to boot, he was a founding member of the Design Advocacy Group of Philadelphia. So I think you'll agree that we have a tour de force of experts on Kahn and his life and his architectural work, and please join me in welcoming our panel to the stage.
This is unrehearsed.
Welcome everyone. It's great that a conversation about Louis Kahn still brings out a crowd. It's not Frank Lloyd Wright only. I thought since we're in Namaj, in the Jewish Museum, that I would start with the basics, a basic question. About Louis Kahn, it's pretty straightforward. Was Kahn a Jewish architect or an architect who happened to be Jewish? And how do you think that his Jewish upbringing influenced his architecture? Who wants to try that one?
I guess I'm the one.
Susan.
Designated hitter.
Yeah. When I came to Penn, I came to work with David, under David. David was my dissertation supervisor. And I knew I wanted to write about Kahn. And David suggested to me that I write about Kahn's public work for the Jewish community. And I thought that was a terrible idea because I thought Kahn was so, to my mind, secular and so distant from the Jewish community that it would be a bunch of sort of negative evidence. But David wisely persisted, and I decided, well, I'll look at one thing very early in the post-war existence, and it was Kahn's trip to Israel in 1949. So I was there at the birth, the 1-year anniversary of statehood, and he was there. anyway, first I have to tell you, David was extremely right and wise, and this got me hooked. But what was so interesting about this is that there was this whole layer of how he went about this trip, which was organized by somebody he had probably known when he was working in Washington during the war for the Public Housing Authority. And it was a small group of mostly developers and philanthropists. They were there to look at what to do for emergency housing immediately, or that was what they were tasked to do. And after 3 weeks, Kahn said, no, we should not be doing something temporary. And famously said, there's nothing as permanent as something temporary. And he was the minority on the group. But that was sort of part of understanding who he was, but how invested he became in Israel and in this moment of total euphoria and optimism. And he totally bought into it and in a very, very positive way. So it wasn't just having this idea about where the temporary housing should go. It was also Israel could be the place, could manufacture housing that you would spend a little more money on now, but you could build into for the future. So you would give people, the main part was you would give people dignity. You would give them a place for permanence. And so it was everything that I was beginning to see about Kahn all sort of coalesced early in Israel, and I felt that that was a significant strand, and that stayed with him his entire life because he really had figured out too. I mean, I think we also often think of him as being sort of up in the clouds and not paying much attention to what's happening around him, but before he went to Israel, he knew who he was supposed to meet, and he knew who the movers and shakers already were. And those are the people that got him two really terrific commissions after the Six-Day War in Jerusalem. So that was one strand. But then the other strand was, well, what happens when he actually is commissioned to do synagogues after the war? And there is always this tension that he really doesn't know much.
Did he have a Jewish education?
None, as far as we can tell.
But he was culturally Jewish, right? He was a Roosevelt Democrat, so.
He was what?
He was a Roosevelt Democrat.
Yeah, that's for sure.
That's right.
Yes, that's definitely true. Culturally Jewish, and you know, it's funny. I met somebody, the rabbi who commissioned the synagogue that was built for Chappaqua. I actually he didn't really have anything to do with Kahn getting that commission, but I met him before he died, and I said something about Kahn being a secular Jew. And he said, oh, no, he wasn't a secular Jew. And I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, because and this was probably the early 80s, so I don't know if our definition of secular has changed. It may have, but I think what he was trying to tell me was that he was someone you could connect with culturally, and that he wasn't someone who denied his Judaism, but he didn't really have much to stand on as far as background. And the thing that I've always found most telling is on one of the drawings for Mikveh Israel, there's this notation on the bottom that says Kiddush, Kaddish. And like he is trying to figure out in his own mind, and it was important at Mikveh because they actually had a room for Kiddush, for the wine and challah after services. And so he's trying to figure out in his own mind which is which, and you know, when is Kaddish said for someone who's died and when's. And so I found that as like, this is really someone who's trying hard, but he doesn't know a whole lot.
That's pretty amazing. David, you were going to add something?
No, I was just going to say, I think that, I mean, the thing that I find most compelling about the early Jewish, the early Israel visit, which Susan has written about, is his connection to the project of society building. And indeed, of course, in that context, strongly imbued with Jewish ideals. But he'd just come off, you know, a dozen years or more working for the New Deal and then building workers' housing. And society building was what he reckoned architects did. And he was certainly attuned to that project and to the cultural setting in which he worked.
Yeah.
And he'd done other significant you know, he was doing other projects for the Jewish community as well. Summer camps and labor union headquarters, and that those connections were quite strong in a broad cultural sense.
Yeah.
I mean, the people he knew, you know, everybody gets their first jobs from the people they know, from their family and from their friends. And it does seem that his community of friends and associates were very largely Jewish.
I think I think that was very typical of the time.
Yeah.
That was.
So as we know, often it's other people who determine whether you're Jewish or not, regardless of how you think of yourself. So how much of his career was stymied by anti-Semitism? Have you looked into that, Bill?
I mean, I think you look at the history of Philadelphia architecture, and there's always, you know, it seems like the architects who are Jewish, they tend to be pushed into corners, right? And
Magaziner.
yeah. And even at the schools, you know, you see that history. But I think, you know, Kahn and his hard work and his perseverance just, you know, convinced everyone he could do it and he could move beyond it. He worked as a very, you know, fresh out of Penn, he got a job with the city architect. And I imagine he really wanted to work for his professor, Paul Cray, which eventually he did. But he had the option of going to work for the city architect, and confronted with the sesquicentennial exposition, his boss was having trouble with that. His boss couldn't handle the pressure. Kahn found him drunk in the baths, you know, before
Is that
meeting
why it turned out so badly?
Well, with a big.
It rained.
Well, basically, Kahn saved the guy's bacon, you know, and
Which is not kosher.
Totally. And worked incredibly hard and made as much as his boss that year, right? You know, so that he, through his hard work, his talent, his perseverance, he established a place for himself. And that's a remarkable, you know, accomplishment.
Is there any truth? I mean, some people have suggested that, speaking of bacon, Edmund Bacon,
Great transition. Not kosher.
You know, kind of was distrustful of Kahn, because, you know, maybe because he wasn't part of, you know, establishment Philadelphia. Do you think there's any truth to that?
Well, certainly, I only knew Bacon late in his life and after Kahn was dead, and he was ferocious in his negative assessment of Kahn at that time.
And of course, the scene in the movie.
Oh, and the scene in the movie is classic, but it was by no means the only opportunity he had to express those views. I mean, to be honest, I think that the challenge that Bacon felt had nothing to do with ethnicity. It had to do with an architect of talent and strong will, and a vision as big and as powerful, and maybe bigger and more powerful than his own. And I think that was the anxiety that. And
temperament.
Temperament, yes. I mean, and I think that Bacon prized decisiveness, and Kahn prized a more thoughtful and iterative approach to solutions. And I think that was a challenge to Bacon. But I don't. It's hard to know. It's hard to read, to run history back, and to know. And I wouldn't dare to speculate what Bacon had in his heart.
Kahn aspired to create an architecture that was timeless and as classic as the ancient monuments, and he often succeeded, and that's a pretty hard act to follow. In terms of his legacy and his influence on modernist architecture, is he a one-off, or did he influence the trajectory of modernism? Bill, I'm sure you've written a lot about that issue.
Oh, I think it's without a doubt. I mean, in my job every day at the Architectural Archives, I see people coming from around the world that keep coming back to the work because it opens up so many ideas about what's great about architecture and how people connect to one another through architecture and how it extends and enriches the world around us, and that somehow he was able to, through this hard work, discover that and find new pathways into it that are rich and powerful, right? And there's a handful of buildings. And yet, every time I go up to Yale and see the Yale Art Gallery, and just the way the concrete is done, and the pride in the mistakes in the concrete, that you get these little marks of the making that start to tell you a story, right? And so he had this great gift of being able to reveal and tell stories in architecture that could connect with more than just academics and theoreticians. It connected to people in the everyday sense, and that's a very difficult thing to do, and maybe that's part of the timeless aspect.
It seems that he really came into his own at a moment when people were becoming perhaps a little disenchanted with the international style, with these very light glass buildings, and he offered something heavy and weighty and timeless. Was he the first one to do it, or we saw inklings of it with a few other architects, maybe Saarinen? Did he inspire others to go back to the idea of weight and monumentality? Do you think? Yeah,
I think history is written as a joint project of many people, and I don't want to say that Kahn was the only person who did anything, but he was one of a generation, and I think it's fair to say that he was the most influential of a generation who, just as you say, saw that modernism, whose battles had been tremendous, that modernism had won and had subsided into being a kind of style. That it was fashionable at first to be modern, and then it was boring to be modern. And that's more or less where we were in the 1950s. There's a wonderful set of cartoons by Saul Steinberg in which he suggests that the way modern architects were designing skyscrapers was by taking graph paper and simply cutting it out and pasting it on their drawings. And they're a whole wonderful set of cartoons that are like that. They're all the buildings are the same. You can buy them, and you don't have to sharpen a pencil to do it. And architecture had become routine. And what Kahn did, and I think it was a tonic at that moment and continues to be a tonic now, was to assert that architecture was much more than it was a matter of styles, that it was deeply and morally engaged in human life. And it's really, again, that sort of circles back to your first question. I think he engaged with his Jewish heritage as one aspect of engaging with life, with human life, and the communities of people who inhabited his buildings. He famously and rather opaquely said that architecture began with form and then developed into design. And by form, just in order to baffle people completely, he didn't mean physical form. He meant the shape of the society or the institution that made use of the building. And it had to start with that. And it was that sort of focus on the human significance of architecture that was a great, of great importance and a great tonic at the time. And tied to that was his emphasis on the real and tangible significance of the building itself. That it was, as you said, the lightweight building he put aside. And when the Richards building was under construction and people came to see it and it was exhibited at the Museum of Modern Art, it really did seem like there were other people doing interesting work at that time, but that building really did crystallize the change that was possible in architecture and emboldened others to move in the same direction.
I often feel when I'm walking through the Penn campus that I see Kahn-like buildings. And I was recently, for the first time, in the Windfield Public Library in West Philadelphia, which is by Montgomery and Bishop. And I felt
you published a piece on that.
Yes, I did. I read about it.
Read about it.
And one of the interesting things about it, and I find this a very Kahn-like thing, is there was a slot window with like a clerestory window forming this perfect T, which I see in a lot of Kahn's work. So what are some buildings that are Kahn-like around Penn, around the city? Susan, you probably spent some time and then during your years at Penn.
Well, I have a favorite sort of Kahn descendant, but it's in San Francisco, and just to make it difficult for everybody. But it's Stanley Seidowitz's synagogue for Beth Shalom, and
he's a great admirer of
absolutely, and he really he understood it in that he broke. So this was an old conservative synagogue in the city that didn't really want to move, but needed a new structure. They were willing to tear down the sanctuary. They kept the school in the back, but where it had been a building facing a major artery that goes, I guess, north-south in the city. What Stanley Seidowitz did is he divided the sanctuary into this freestanding, it's almost like people have thought of it as Noah's Ark, and it's a very strong geometric half circle, basically, sitting on a plinth, and then you ascend upstairs to get to the sanctuary, and then to get to the social hall, which is in a separate building. So this division of space to make it more inhabitable. But what really struck me in that building is how he uses light. And there's no decoration. And it reflected to me what Kahn, the best ideas about Mikveh Israel, which were that you didn't need decoration. And ironically, I'm now looking at decoration, but that I think he understood that maybe the most sublime experience would be just to have light and to see how light can reflect. But it's always this, he's obsessed with light without glare. And that seems so mundane, but it's so critical to the experience. I mean, I think we tend to lose sight of the fact that synagogues exist to enable people to pray, but they're not necessary for people to pray. I mean, it seems sort of contradictory, and a synagogue exists anywhere you have 10 people, and so you can pray anywhere. They're very necessary for political and social, cultural, educational reasons, but they're not really essential for prayer. But if they exist, they should make it easy for you to pray. And I think the idea that you're not distracted, but that the light adds something that embellishes you, I guess that would be sort of the closest that I would say he came to really being spiritual. And so I don't see, I think I may differ with my colleagues, I don't see a lot of buildings where I feel that those qualities of humaneness and ability to be in a special place really exist.
What about the barns by Todd Williams and Billy Chen? Similar to the Kimball Museum in Fort Worth, you know, they created this very elaborate entry sequence around the back, which Kahn had a similar idea, crossing water, crossing gravel. That seems very much inspired
I was trying to think who are the architects, and I think they're high on my list of people who I feel have imbibed or absorbed what Kahn had to say. And I feel that way. Their Anglinger Center at Princeton feels the same way. And I think that they definitely got it.
Why does Kahn resonate so much in Asia, in Japan? And I know when Tadeo Ando was here, he wanted to be taken to one of Kahn's houses. What do you think the connection is?
I'm going to resist suggesting that there's anything particular about Asian architects that draws them to Kahn, but I do think that there are some threads that are sympathetic, but there are lots of sympathetic threads that connect Kahn with others. Certainly, Indian and other South Asian friends have told me that when Kahn was in India, there was a kind of guru persona that he projected that they felt was appreciated. But I'm not sure that they weren't saying that slightly tongue-in-cheek. That is to say, yeah, a guru, great. No, an American Jewish guru, just what we need. But I do think that I do think that Kahn's seriousness was terribly important. In Asia, in South Asia, and in East Asia, at a time when there was really serious work to be done, nation building and rebuilding after the war. That these are things that were timely, and that and I think that you might see in it too a certain resistance to Western faddism and styles, and an appreciation of things of more enduring and permanent values. But I'm very, very concerned. I'm very anxious not to engage in kind of stereotyping of what sort of people liked Kahn, because I do think that he strove, and to a remarkable degree succeeded in creating a vocabulary that, although it alluded to history, didn't really require that you recognize history in order to understand his buildings, that drew its power from geometry, and as Susan was saying, from light. It was really architecture about the most fundamental things, about structure and light and the human community that architecture contains. Those things that you can have any place and every place.
I would concur with that. I mean, I get to see a lot of these architects, and Taro Ando, when he came, wanted to see the drawings, actually. But there's been this whole group of people who want to come and see places like the Esherick House. And a lot of my education on New Kahn has come from taking others to those buildings and seeing how they respond. And it's really, I'm so lucky that I have that privilege, because sometimes it's a famous architect, sometimes it's a student, and they're pointing out something of why this thing ticks. And it is that sense of that quality of light, the materiality. But since you mentioned Japan, Kahn himself went to Japan in 1960. And what was it that he brought back and thought about in terms of the Esherick House? It was that quality of light, right? He had that powerful experience in the ancient world where he is seeing buildings that are very massive, but he's actually writing back about their light quality, about how light is shaping those volumes. When he's in Japan, he's going to places like Katsura Palace and seeing light modulation in a Japanese way, and is finding a new reservoir of things that he's interested in. I mean, he's intensely interested in how you do this in architecture. And you see him doing these little experimentations in terms of the design of the Esherick House, thinking about elements like the traditional sudare, which is this reed blind that lets a little bit of light in through these cracks, but it's a natural material. And that line of light it's the shape of something. It's the shape of something natural, or it's the shape of something man-made. And how do you do that? How do you figure that out? And that's something he was intensely interested in. Right?
And the courtyards, the Japanese courtyards, the way the houses are built around outdoor space.
It's a part of nature. I mean, the Kimball Art Museum really works, I think, as a beautiful space because it allows for that presence to reveal itself and engage with you through human experience, through that daily experience that an art museum might give you. I mean, I got to work at the Kimball Art Museum for a week, best week ever. And it was March, and the sun sets around 4:30, 5 o'clock. So when you're in that museum, it actually gets the changing light quality is really extraordinary. It's like you're in a great house. And he talks about the museum having that quality, and just a little bit of change of light makes it feel like it just changes how your experience is determined. I mean, there's lights there that are on the artwork, so the direct light on the artwork is the same. It's more the ambiance and how it allows you in that changing light quality to engage with others, to engage with art. It makes certain things possible that a lot of other architecture that's done in this world doesn't get to, that level of understanding and depth.
You have a lot of visitors coming through the archive. Is Kahn is his archive the top requested archive?
No, we get a lot of, it's one among many. I mean, this is where I see the work I do every day, where we have this incredible collection that started 40 years ago with Lou Kahn and a few others, Wilson Eyre. So it wasn't only focused on Kahn, but it has incredible people like Bob Venturi, Denise Scott Brown, Lawrence Halpern. And the fun for me is drawing on all those different points of view about how you think about the world in a creative way, and you do new work in it. And Kahn is this incredible reservoir because he's so drawn out in his thinking. He talked to others. There's this beautiful back and forth that you see between his students, his clients, those that worked for him, and you learn so much from those conversations. So he's a really good resource that you can direct towards teaching young architects and landscape architects about what this business ought to be about.
His work is such a mix of his life story, his emigration from Estonia as a small boy, his upbringing in North Philadelphia, his interest in progressive causes, his education in the Beaux-Arts tradition at Penn, the Rome Prize. I was wondering if each of you could talk about how these pieces of his biography show up in his work.
I'll start.
Yeah.
So I think that you're quite right, and what you've aptly summarized is a complete picture of Kahn, an appropriate picture of Kahn that was really not much appreciated during his own lifetime. The myth was that he basically emerged on the architectural stage in 1951 with the design of the Yale Art Gallery, and before that he'd done nothing, and he spoke wonderful mystical things and charmed people and passed through life barely touching the ground. I mean, there was that kind of Kahn. But no, he was very much on the ground like his buildings were, and I do think that each aspect of that early life, growing up a poor kid in Philadelphia, but being remarkably well cared for by public schools and scholarships and weekend programs and fellowships and scholarships, and then to come to Penn at a time when Penn was probably certainly the leading architecture school in the country, and receiving an education that was deeply imbued with the lessons of the École des Beaux-Arts, the great French system of teaching classicism, not as a style of architecture, but a way of thinking about architecture. And then to be cast out and graduate and come into young manhood on the eve of the Depression, and after a quick trip to Europe, get a job with after working on the Sesqui, taking a quick trip to Europe, seeing everything, visiting Le Corbusier's office, coming back to America, and then going to work for his former teacher, Paul Cray, finishing up the Rodin Museum. And then going to work joining up with a bunch of young architects who are interested in housing and progressive causes. And just goes, I mean, all of that enriches and deepens his experience.
I feel that he was very aware of what was going on at the time in the post-war period, in the late 40s, 50s. And he's doing similar things, but they turn out differently. People talk about the pavilion plans in schools, for instance, and at the same time as the Trenton Bathhouse. But the Trenton Bathhouse doesn't look like what's being done at that particular moment by the majority of architects who are being published. So I feel like he's absorbing it from so many places, but has the ability to turn it into something that's very personal. And in a way, I want to say expressionistic. I don't know if that's pushing him into something he doesn't belong in. But I feel each building is so personal and so particular to him.
I guess I would add, he designed a lot of houses and, well, he didn't drive. And so these houses don't have garages. So there's a literal.
But he did design a big garage that didn't.
Well,
get
that's
built.
the point I was going to make is he tries to reinvent the nature of urban expression, and there's this beautiful drawing that's actually tiny. It's about this big. It's a bird's eye view of Philadelphia, and you see he's left William Penn on top of City Hall, and many Philadelphia architects sought to tear that down, and for a time Kahn did too a little bit. But then he's reinvented the city with these giant harbors that are garages, right? And the guy doesn't know how to drive a car. It's this circular thing. You just wonder, it would be a horror. For me, just thinking and spending time thinking about growing up in Northern Liberties and those twisty streets and none of the buildings. I mean, I found his public school enrollment record, and this is the little card where, your parents want to know where you are if something goes, or the school wants to know where your parents are if there's something happens. So there was 15 addresses in 10 years. None of the buildings survive. They're all gone, and that whole physical infrastructure of buildings is gone. The streets are still there, and these little places where you can, engage somebody and come across somebody, and things happen. In the urban space of the city and in how you connect to others in that fabric. I think that's something that permeates the work in a fascinating way that's maybe a little difficult for us to get back to because the actuality of that space is so changed.
Certainly in Nathaniel Kahn's film, My Architect, he makes a lot of connections between Kahn's life story, an early incident where his face was scarred by piece of hot coal he likens to the scarred concrete, the monumentality of a couple of surviving factory buildings in Northern Liberties to the monumentality in his work. I mean, does that sound right to you? No. That's a stretch.
No, well.
Yeah.
I think there's a sense and a feel for craft in a lot of the architects who worked in Philadelphia. There's a beauty in the selection of materials and in how they reveal themselves. And I think that there's maybe a stronger connection with traditions like that. You look at the brickwork at the University Museum, which is this beautiful surface that is very irregular, and it's not, hey, it looks like my face. It's that the quality of light when it hits that surface is very.
And it was built before he was born, so it wasn't, I would just add, I think one of the things, Philadelphia was a great center of the craft of making architecture in the early 20th century. And it was also, of course, a great industrial city where there were big things to be seen. There were gigantic railway viaducts that brought the Reading Railroad and the Pennsylvania Railroad into the center of the city. They were building the Benjamin Franklin Parkway that involved tearing up a quarter of the city, a huge public works project. These things were occurring in this big industrial city. And I think that and of course in our lifetime that all had been done, that was all over. But he was there while those things were vividly alive and to some extent being made. And I think that gave a kind of scale to his imagination. When he sweepingly imagines gigantic parking garages surrounding the entire city, he's really not talking about anything different in scale from what was already there.
I want to add, too, that I think Kahn is a very difficult architect to understand or to explain. And as much as I adore Nathaniel's movie, which is superb, I think we often look for very simple reasons to make his complicated nature understood. And that can become difficult.
Yeah. So he definitely had a complicated nature, and in some ways he was very ahead of his time in his hiring at his office. He had a very international cast there. You could find people from Asia, You could find African Americans, women. It's kind of incredible that it was such a diverse office in the 50s. And we know he had at least 2, maybe 3, maybe more affairs with women who worked for him. And 2 of those affairs were long-term and consensual, as far as we know, and quite well documented. But in light of the Me Too movement, I wonder, should we begin to reassess his treatment of women? Both Anne Ting and Harriet Patterson had their careers truncated because of those affairs. Maybe they didn't get credit. We can talk about Anne Ting's contributions, especially. Should we be reassessing? Can I get any of you to touch that?
I would just say I think it's our responsibility as people who are alive in the world today to reassess everything all the time, and to live our own lives in our own time, and bring our understandings to the way we think about the past. There are a couple of things that I just want. I mean, I do feel. One of the things that I think it's important to, I mean, there are really some notable things. In addition to what you just cited about his positive record, he actually chaired the National AIA's Committee on Desegregation in the 1940s. It was kind of, he was, sort of literally politically involved in some of the things that we would be glad to celebrate him for being involved in.
He was personally strongly committed to desegregation?
I believe he was. I mean, I don't think that there's any, I don't feel that, certainly in talking, well, I have no, again, I can't say for certain. It's just that the evidence suggests that he was, perhaps in a way that is kind of naive, kind of blind. And perhaps was blind to some injustices because he didn't really feel some of the prejudices that others did. The other thing that I think it's important to do is to not. I don't think we serve the people who worked with him well by construing them as victims or powerless people. I think that the quantity of agency that they possess, that Anne Ting and Harriet Patterson possessed, that many of the people who worked with him possessed. But I do think there's also a general phenomenon is that there are many great architects whose offices are, in fact, they are not places where other great architects live and prosper. And that is to say, this is a one-person operation. These are buildings designed by one person, and I think that's something that reflects, that shapes the experience of people working for him, regardless of gender or race, and I think that has to be factored into that. But it just goes back to the original. I think we have to always be careful and reevaluate everything on the basis of what we now believe and feel.
Susan, do you think that Anne Ting deserves more credit than she gets for the Trenton Bathhouse and maybe also for the Yale Art Gallery?
I'm very torn about the bathhouse. Certainly the plan changed when she came back from Rome. There's no question about it. The whole roof, I think, was being rethought before she came back. I don't know if he would have. I just don't know. I've always sort of been torn by that, and because he was sort of going towards a centralized plan, whether it would have ended up as clear as it did without her help, I don't. I honestly, I don't know, and I think. Things like the City Tower, she was definitely written out of. Bill can address that, and David can address that more than I can. But Trenton is very hard to figure out. And I just don't know.
I don't think I have heard from anybody that Kahn's office was a scary place to work. I recently did an exhibition involving a landscape architect, and in the conversation with some of the people that worked for the landscape architect, they talked about working on the Getty and recognizing that there was an architect and a presence there that somebody was the women were being protected from this person. This is Richard Meier. Right? And it just shocked me that that is part of practice, that you have that. And so I got to know Ann Ting really well. I mean, she's someone I'm incredibly indebted to and fond of. And I got to spend time with her and to hear the kind of opportunities that she had to do great work. And, and that, I mean, I would ask her, I mean, did you, was that painful to that when you were marginalized in a sense? I mean, they fell out of love, I guess, right? He did something with my ideas, right? That there was something that there was validation, there was strength, there was power, and that my ideas are worth something and important, right? But I do have, I spend a lot of time with the drawings. I mean, there's 36,000 drawings in the Kahn collection, and not all of them are by Lou Kahn. There's all these hands that are there, and it's one of my talents, or one of my responsibilities, I think, to spend time recognizing those different hands. So you can recognize Ann Ting's drawings because they're crisp, they're precise, they're white hot. And that there is, I think, a sort of respect that comes out of what she could bring in that individual voice into the work that's really inspiring. But the flip side of that for me is that you can see where there's a parting of the interest, that what Ann was bringing in terms of this strong interest in geometry as an organizing principle and her belief in that, and how that was beginning to diverge from where Lou Kahn was interested. And I see her getting marginalized, right? And, which is painful to see because this person and what she's done, right? But you know what? Lou Kahn was interested in a lot of things. He was trying to do great architecture. He was breaking through, but I don't see that as that's, divergence of what is architecture really about, that they grew together greatly. But anyway, I don't think it was a scary place.
It wasn't the Mad Men atmosphere. No. Yeah. You introduced me to a wonderful person, Henry Wilcox, who was African American, who he really sort of had to twist his arm and said, "Please come work for me."
Right.
And I've met Henry, and it's such an incredible story in that period in America that he would seek out an African American architect and have him come work with him, and they traveled together. He was his right-hand man, and can you talk about that a little bit, about their relationship?
Yeah, so Henry Wilcox, born and raised in Des Moines, Iowa, and went to the Des Moines Art Center, studied drawing there, and just he's one of these great spirits who served his country as a Marine, running up and down hills in Korea, managed to get the last month of the GI Bill so he could go to school. Trained in Colorado, but because he was African American and in his last semester of school, he got a full-time job and he dropped out of school before he got the degree, just recognizing the fact, well, I'm never going to have my own office, right? And so that takes you back to 1950s, America, and where opportunities were limited and how far we have come, thankfully. But Henry is someone that Lou Kahn met in Bangladesh, and Henry was working for others in Pakistan. And they were kind of paired together, and they were on a journey together, right? And I think so many of the people that really worked well with Kahn and resonated with him were people that Kahn could travel with, right? Not literally and figuratively, that they were game for a journey. And Henry was certainly someone who could offer a different voice, a different perspective, and was one of the, perhaps one of the few people that could tell Lou he was wrong and get away with it. And, I think there was not a lot of people that, in my experience of hearing the voices from the office, if I could put it that way, that could manage that, right? And he's still with us. He's probably about 95 and still a spark.
Yes.
And
pretty amazing.
Incredible.
Well, maybe we'll open this up to the audience for questions. Is there anyone who has something they want to ask? There are microphones and people in the aisle who pass it to you.
You talked about Kahn as an artist and architect. You talked about his personal life. I wonder whether you can talk about him as a businessman, because those of us who are architects that are trying to be creative and have a personal life also have to try to figure out how to run a business. And Kahn famously ended up tremendously in debt. And what's the thought about Kahn as trying to figure out how to charge for a particular project, how he did it, and how he just revisited projects over and over again until he felt they were done?
$469,350. That's his debt at the time he died. And I just would say that's the cost of the great art that we have, right? And that, there was incredible tension and pressure in the office to make ends meet. But there's 120 boxes that came to Penn in the late 70s, along with all the drawings. And about a third of them are the financial records of the office. And I just got to thinking the other day is that nobody has really spent time looking at that question that you're raising.
Sam's volunteering too.
Is it true that the state of Pennsylvania bought the archives to pay off the debts?
Yeah.
Yes. Oh, yes. Yeah. It was a remarkable story. I mean, it passed by one vote, right? This was this was a remarkable thing that the state did, and they then deposited the collection at Penn. So it's actually owned by the state. It's our public property.
And there was a lot of union backing.
Yes, that's right. The construction unions were very strongly in support of it.
Bricklayers.
Yeah.
Probably the last architect to get along with the construction union.
One thing I always found interesting looking in the archives is he seemed to always be a subscriber to Forbes magazine. So I think he was always trying to figure it out. I don't think he was ignoring the possibility.
He thought it was fiction.
Yeah.
I saw the documentary recently again. And I found, other than the 3 children thing, 2 quotes of him I thought were sort of slippery or confusing. One was when he's talking to the students about wood, and wood is saying, do this. There was, it implied that there was like one way, I think it was wood, I mean, tell me if it was different material, but there's one thing to do with wood, and wood is telling you this, but it doesn't make sense. I mean, people have used wood to do dozens of different things, hundreds of different things in history. And then when he's talking about Bangladesh, it was almost like he was trying to avoid being pinned down. And sort of, in addition to the thing with the children, he came across, I thought, as a sort of fairly slippery character. I'm wondering if you can comment on that. I mean, particularly the thing about wood. If you have any, comments on that. I think the material was wood, but
I think it's
what does
brick.
he mean? Brick. Okay, what does he mean? It's only brick is telling you what to do with it. I mean, you can do millions of things with brick.
Well, I'll take a first stab at it. You're right. You can do anything you want with brick or wood, because human beings are incredibly ingenious and we can bend it to our will. And that's what his point is. He says that we should examine the materials and try to figure out what what their physical properties are best used for, and that wood, for instance, might be used to be a lintel over a doorway because of its elasticity and its ability to sustain twists and bends and bending motion, whereas a long piece of stone might break. Simple stuff like that. But yes, you could figure out how to do it with any material you want, but he wanted architecture to arrive more directly out of the elemental stuff of light and math and material, and I would say also out of an understanding of the fundamentals of human life. And it was that fundamentalism that was important, and an effort not to be clever, not to figure out how to make it work, and And he would have said that that was more honest, that that was more sincere, and ultimately more effective as well, more universal. And a little slippery. Because he did like to mysticize it up. I said it before, he, in the beginning of his, in the 50s, he began to talk about architecture being a process of moving from form to design, having an idea and abstraction and making it real. Well, by the end of his career, he was talking about that was moving from silence to light. Ooh. But it's the same thing.
Yes, I had the pleasure and experience to spend a great deal of time in Lou Kahn's office, and I totally agree with Professor Brownlee. That is that and I can just say that when he started thinking about the architecture or started the process, there was no preconception about any material at all. And I recently, in trying to answer a question that was posed to me about whether the authenticity of a model that was in the collection, I started thinking about it. And that model could never have been out of the office because of the amount of detail that was in that model at its inception. And to me, it always started with a clay model, and then it evolved into different materials like cardboard or wood, very elaborate models. As more was known about what the building was made of, the material of the model would change, and the amount of effort that the office spent, the manpower to create those models, it was just alarming in one way, but so powerful in another. Yeah. It was like the coming of the building. Those charrettes were almost like in a year when you started with Pakistan and a little clay model just from scratching on plasticine to creating a huge model out of cardboard to show the laborers how a building went together. We even did the footings, foundations, piles. It was amazing.
Let me comment, just if I can.
I want to answer if I may. And I also worked in the office with Vincent for a number of years. And I think this question was a very naive question about the only way a material could be. I think you have to remember that Lou was a philosopher as well as an architect. And that when people ask what a brick wants to be, he was speaking in philosophical terms. He was not talking about putting together a brick just in an arch. He was talking about the philosophy of material. So that your question about, only one way to use a brick or only one way to use a piece of wood was a metaphysical question that Lou was responding to. You couldn't ask a question of Lou in the same way that this man is asking this question. It would have been insulting because you didn't really know. I mean, it was a philosophical answer, and Lou spoke as a philosopher. Lou, was visionary in his responses. So the question is it's upsetting to me.
Well, Lou was a great teacher. Right, and I alluded to that in my comments earlier. I mean, there's so much you learn from him by what he does in the buildings. There's so much you learn from him by just looking and spending time with the drawings. And the idea of him asking, what does a brick want to be? If you listen to his remarks in the lecture in 1973 in Pratt, I mean, you hear he's like, there's humor, there's a bit of humor in it, because he recognizes that he's trying to get you to think beyond yourself and perhaps more narrow definitions of what things are about. And it's incredibly inspiring. A point I just wanted, because Vince, who's someone I learn a lot from people like Vince. I learn a lot, from people like David and Susan as well. But it was someone was offering a model up to the Museum of Modern Art for sale that was supposedly done by Lou Kahn. And my colleagues up there asked, what is it? Is this really authentic? And I looked at it and this is not right. But it's like, you want to do the due diligence. These are important colleagues. You want to ask. So I talked to the guys, right? So it was Vince and Henry and a few others. And we tossed it around a bit just looking at this. And it was Vince saying, you know, we all kind of agreed it just doesn't look right. But then Vince nailed it in a sense by saying, and you just don't know these unless you're in the office. You don't have these observations and these understandings. A model at that scale, so it's a 2-story, 3-story building, so it's about that big. So that's 1/4-inch scale, something like that. We would have included certain amounts of detail. This model didn't have that detail, so it was just not right, right? And now I know why, right? So again, this is where you there's still a lot of things to learn from this physical material we have by this group of people, and there's a few of them here tonight that have that firsthand experience. But you know, the older I get, the more I realize those people aren't going to be around forever, and that's a little heartbreaking for me.
So was that a fraud that someone was trying to pass off as a?
I think that would be too harsh to say that. Sometimes models are made in other circumstances, but certainly at the very least it had been changed.
It might have been made by a student who was working on a project along this, you know, at school alongside it. Yeah.
It could have been a model on the project given to the students.
Exactly. That's right. That's what I meant. That's what I meant. Yeah.
Who worked or studied with Kahn, and when he was down there in Iran, model especially, that was a very celebrated event during that time.
Yeah.
But I would also want you to say that it's the making of models, like when he started with charcoal on yellow paper, and then he started scratching the surface of a bed of clay, you know, evolving the question of what does this building want to be.
It's definitely hands-on.
Yeah.
There's a question over here.
We should take another question first.
My question speaks to what is being talked about right now. There are a number of people in the room who worked for Kahn for whatever period of time, and there are more that aren't necessarily in Philadelphia. And I was wondering, especially a question to the academics, has anybody gone through, searched out these people, and done oral histories? Because this is a resource that is dwindling quickly, and it might be, as you had Vince to call, a very useful kind of, you know, primary source that you'd get different opinions, I'm sure, but I think you get an overall great deal of information.
Well, I'll just say, I mean, we have been doing oral. I started working on Kahn in the late 80s, and oral history collection has been part of the research that I think all of us have done. It's a vast project, but we've done a great deal of it, and there's undoubtedly more to do.
I've learned to carry books like this for that reason. This is number 45. And I tell all my students, do you put your name in your book? You know, if lost, please return to. Because I have so many conversations that I don't have a recording device. I don't have something on the ready. No. And someone's there and they say something a particular way, right? That takes me into that moment. So when, you know, we were on the phone with this example of the model, or 100 other instances, I put these into notebooks where I've got a lot of these different voices. And I've only been doing it for about 5 years, and I've been in my position for 25. So I recognize that I also lost a lot of very specific voices, and I'm working my damnedest to make sure I don't lose any more.
Wendy Lesser, who recently wrote a very good biography of Kahn, she did a tremendous amount of interviews. I mean, I think she found everyone alive, even taxi drivers who knew Kahn. So she must have a great repository of notes and recordings.
I was at Penn when Lou Kahn was there. I was there from 70 to 74. And I had close friends who were in his studio. And of course, I was curious myself to attend, see what it was like. And I have to say, and also their intense reverence for him and the way he would comport himself in the studio, refused to use a microphone. People had come from Thailand who I knew because my studio was in the basement. And I knew their English was not exactly what one might wish. And there they were in the room with Kahn holding forth. You couldn't hear him. There was essentially no back and forth. And I would imagine it was a very tough position for him to be in, and yet at the same time, I imagine that Penn did pay him, as opposed to maybe other clients not. But I felt for him as a person, I felt great concern for him because he seemed not to be handling the interaction with these students in a direct and in a manner that promoted and welcomed back and forth. I saw no back and forth. I just saw adulation. And I'm not saying it wasn't deserved. I think they saw his deep reverence for the philosophy in architecture, and they appreciated him for that. But still, if it were I who had to pay to come around the world, I would have insisted that he use a microphone because he spoke very quietly, and that's not right.
Well, the only saving grace is that he tended to say the same thing over and over again. and if you manage to hear it once,
and it was printed.
But you're right. I don't think any of us. There are not many long conversational episodes that I think we have recorded.
So I don't know much about architecture. I grew up in Chappaqua, New York, and I attended Temple Bethel. So it was interesting for me because I kind of experienced that synagogue without any understanding of architecture, without any understanding really that it was unique and very special. Obviously, it was a beautiful building to me. Obviously, a lot of the things you're talking about resonate with me now. One thing I became aware of as I got older was the influence of the synagogues of Europe that were destroyed in the Holocaust on the design of that building. And I was curious if you could talk a little bit more about that, and also just generally about some of the other influences that kind of informed his work.
I've been there a couple times. Most recently, there's been major renovation done that I don't think enhances the building. But I always felt that it was not a particularly successful Kahn building. It was in some ways better than contemporary synagogues, but I felt the whole way he handled light there was the way he said he would never handle light. And tell me if your experience was that it was not a glare-free environment when you were sitting there. Is that true? I mean, that was the feeling I got. That
it's funny because when you said that before, that was the thought that I had. It was the way it's filled with windows. So you have that high ceiling.
Right.
With all the windows kind of stacked up to the top.
Exactly. Right.
And direct light,
and the way the light reflects in, I always felt like it came across but didn't come down on you. I'm not sure if I can answer that well, but I'm really curious to hear your thoughts.
I think we're saying the same thing.
Yeah.
And as far as it reflecting or evoking the destroyed wooden synagogues of Eastern Europe, I think that was very much on his mind. I'm not sure that's, if I remember, I haven't looked at that material in a long time, but I don't think that was what the congregation asked for, but I think that they ran with it after the building was completed, because one thing I remember is they had a big ledge with books out, and before you go into the sanctuary, in fact, I really appreciated the fact that they appreciated Kahn, and that they wanted to make this historical connection. But it was on his mind, but it was more in the sort of general massing of the building than the particulars of how those synagogues were constructed, and even how the arrangement of the bima and the ark would have been.
Yeah, I too am not at all a professional, but I'm interested in architecture and find a lot of what I've seen of his architecture to be beautiful and very impressive. But I've been also given to understand that Richard's Labs is not a very good place conducive to the work that goes on there. And I wonder if any of you would comment on that.
Well, Richards was famously unsuccessful. What I mentioned to you before about Kahn's way of wishing to begin a design with an idea of the kind of human activity that would go on inside it, I will say flat out that I think Penn was a terrible client and didn't define what the activity was that was going to go on inside it. And he created a building perfectly adapted for something else, which was his idea of what should go on inside it. You know, have you seen the building since it's recently been thoroughly restored and made whole again? Do you know, have you seen the building in the last couple of years?
Just from the outside.
Okay, well, what's the challenge for the building was that Kahn imagined that laboratory research would occur in light-filled studios in which teams of scientists working together would collaborate in a group that needed a space of about 45 by 45 feet. They'd never need more space, they'd never need less space, they didn't require any privacy, and they didn't really need to talk to anybody else. That wasn't true, any of that, but Penn said, go with it. I mean, I suspect part of this is that Kahn was extraordinarily convincing. And so even as the building was under construction, it was being partitioned and divided up, and really made into a very, a quite unsatisfactory environment. The good news is that the medical school has recently decided that they will give up trying to use the building as a wet lab and use it for desktop research. And they've been able to open up almost all the floors, bring in natural light, and it's really splendid and wonderful. Because there are kinds of human activity that can take place in those kind of spaces. And today's movement towards open office layouts certainly is conducive to that. So the building, has sort of blossomed, I think, in recent years in that way. I would say, the building is it was a great failure, but filled with the most important and useful kind of ideals that architecture ought to be shaped by the nature of the human activity that it contains. It's just that they got it wrong in this case.
And yet, Jonas Salk saw it, and it was inspired to hire Kahn.
He was, but he said, I will not build a building like that. This is for the Salk Institute at La Jolla, California, that wonderful oceanside site. And Kahn's first designs for Salk were for a cluster of towers. And Salk said no. And as sublimely beautiful as the Salk site is, the laboratories have no view of the ocean. They're huge sort of industrial workshop floors that can be subdivided and changed any way you like. No distracting views, hum of the air conditioner. No, but that was the kind of, he was inspired by Kahn's ability to create form, but he really, he saw that wasn't working. At least, honestly, that's what Salk said when we interviewed him, talking about oral history back in the late 80s.
Well, it looks like we're out of time, but it's really wonderful that you've all come and you're all interested in Kahn, and there's much, much more to learn. And we're really lucky to have this great group of Kahn experts here. So let's thank them.